So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to canter through lots of different things, and hopefully there'll be something for everyone. I am here at the event for the next for the whole event. So if you wanted to catch me afterwards for any questions or just anything that I haven't covered that you're interested in, then do feel free to come and find me. So mistake on the first slide. So what I'm going to cover is making sure that you get the basics right in setting up a volunteer programme, some of the cultural issues that you need to have a think about when involving volunteers. I'm going to have a quick signpost really and a little bit of a chat about how volunteers are changing and what that means as volunteer managers today, and run you through a very quick case study of how we've done some changes at the Blue Cross that you might just find useful. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. So in terms of getting the basics right, and this will be a really quick canter through, it's really important that you have a volunteer policy in place. So you and your senior managers, your leaders, your trustees, your managers, and all of the people working in the organisation are really clear about why you involve volunteers and how important that is. And also so your volunteers know the value of volunteering at the organisation and why they want to get involved. It's also really important that you have a think about the structure of volunteer management. So who's going to be responsible for managing volunteers? Some charities have dedicated volunteer coordinators or volunteer managers. Other charities choose to empower all of their colleagues, all their paid colleagues, to manage volunteers as part of their day jobs. At Blue Cross, we have paid volunteer coordinators at every site and every shop. And we have project managers who are dedicated to managing volunteers as well. So it really enables us to dedicate a lot of time to managing our volunteers. And since we moved to that structure, we've really seen a notable difference in the way our volunteers have engaged with us. But it's not right for everybody. A lot of charities do engage all of their team members in supporting volunteers. So it's about what's the right structure for your teams. It's really important then that you have a think about resourcing. So volunteers aren't a free resource, although often people are heard to say that. They still need as much training, support, reward, recognition and management time as any other person working for the organisation. So it's really important that you get your budget right for volunteer involvement. Managing risk is really important. So you need to make sure you've thought about what are the risks of involving volunteers, and at Blue Cross we make sure that all of our volunteers see the same risk assessments that anyone else in the charity doing the same role would view, and we undertake particular risk assessments for volunteers in certain categories. So any vulnerable volunteers or young volunteers, we do individual risk assessments around them to make sure they're kept safe while they're doing their volunteer role. And we also have a whole set of volunteering procedures at Blue Cross. So some of these are the same as employee procedures. So our health and safety procedures are equally applicable to employees and volunteers, but the way we involve volunteers and the relationship is quite distinct to our employed people. So we also have a set of separate volunteer management procedures that all of our volunteer managers are trained on how to use, and they cover the whole remit of how to involve volunteers. So we've got procedures around recruiting them, training them, supporting them, helping them leave the organisation, and we've got a toolkit of information for our volunteer managers to make sure that they're adhering to best practice in volunteer management as they're managing their volunteers. And we also have a volunteer database. It's separate from our employee database, and it's separate to our fundraising database, or the two do talk to each other. So we're able to take all of our volunteers, pop them onto our supporter database, and so we can see who volunteers and also gives us money. But also, because we've got a bespoke volunteer management database, we're able to really help manage our volunteers through a system. So they can apply online, we can communicate them over the system, we can manage their rotas over the system, send them emails, give them updates about our work. It's really helpful. The next thing you need to think about is, what do you want your volunteers to do? And I suppose you probably have in your mind lots of ways you might want to involve volunteers already, but it's quite useful to be quite creative about this and start thinking about what are the things that you would do as an organisation if you had a bit of extra resource, and what are the skills and experience that you might be able to get from volunteers that you haven't already got existing in the charity. Then you need to put a bit of time into thinking about what are the recruitment strategies relevant to the type of volunteers you're trying to attract. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the diverse volunteer workforce later on, but it's really important that you look for volunteers in the areas where the people with the skills and experiences that you need are going to be. So we have different strategies for our shop volunteers than we do for our animal welfare volunteers or our education volunteers. Learning and development is really important. So not only do we at Blue Cross train our volunteer managers on how to manage volunteers, we also provide quite a lot of training and development to our volunteers themselves so they can carry out their roles successfully and safely, but also so they can develop with us and get more skills while they're working with us and become more and more valuable to us. But we also noticed that it's really important to train the rest of the people that volunteers are going to be working alongside, so our animal welfare assistants, our vet nurses, about how to coach and support volunteers working alongside them. So quite often we notice these people haven't got coaching skills, haven't got managerial or supervisory experience, so it was important that we showed them how to coach people who sometimes may be a lot older, may have had more worldly experience than some of our younger colleagues. So we've done some training and coaching for our teams on how to mentor people working alongside them. How to support and retain your volunteers is a really important thing to have a think about. The recruitment process for volunteers is sort of top heavy, so you spend a lot of time and resource attracting the right volunteers into your organisation, and it's quite sort of time and costly. So it's really important then to have a think about, once you've got them, how are you going to retain your volunteers? And again, this is something that's very specific to your individual organisation. You might have a long service award, you might have thank you cards, certificates, thank you events, or it might just be a case of keeping your volunteers in touch with news as they go through the charity. At Blue Cross, and probably the same for a lot of your organisations, our volunteers hate us spending money on them. So for them, it's a thank you very much for what you've done is much more important than sending them to an event or sending them a thank you card or certificate, although we do all of that as well. And in fact, one of the things that we do fairly recently is we've been nominating our volunteers for awards, and I'm really excited that one of our volunteers is shortlisted to the Volunteer of the Year award that Petplan are announcing tonight. So we're really excited about that. It's a great way of raising awareness of our volunteers, recognising their work, but also it saves, we don't have to spend any money on it, so our volunteers appreciate that sort of involvement as well. And then communications and engagement is really important. Volunteers want to feel involved, they want to feel part of the charity, they want to feel valued. With us, we've got about 3,000 volunteers and about 700 employees. So communications for 3,000 people is much more tricky than the 700 employees. They don't have access to a lot of our internal systems. So we really have to think hard about what's the best way of engaging and communicating with our volunteers. And also we have a challenge that probably most of you face, that some of our volunteers want to hear everything and want to be really involved, and others just want to come along, socialise their cat and then get off. So we have to sort of balance up the different needs of our volunteers when thinking about our communication strategy. And then the last thing is, when planning your volunteer programmes and managing your volunteers, it's really important to think about the whole volunteer life cycle. And so we call this a volunteer journey. I'll pop this slide up. You probably can't read it very well here, but it's fairly similar, fairly simple as you'd expect. It takes you through the whole journey of managing a volunteer. And it's really important as volunteer managers, or when you're planning your volunteer programme, that you take time to think about all of these different steps. So think about planning and promoting your volunteer programme, how you're going to recruit and select your volunteers, how you're going to induct them, who's going to be responsible for day-to-day management, who's going to support and supervise your volunteers, what learning and development and recognition you're going to put in place, and how are you going to help them move on at the end of their placements, or when their relationship isn't quite as positive as it might have been in the start, or when they want to leave, what opportunities are you going to have to bring them back into the fold later on if you want to. So I just put that up there because it's really helpful for us. It helps us focus in on all the problems we might face with volunteers, all the difficulties are going to occur at some point during that journey. So it just helps us focus in on where we need to provide extra support. So one of the key things to remember, and sometimes can get a bit HRE and a bit process orientated in volunteer management. It's really important to keep being progressive and think about the way you develop your programme, so you're not excluding volunteers or putting up unnecessary barriers. And so at Blue Cross, what this means for us is a few things. I just wanted to give you a few examples. We set up a volunteer toolkit probably about 7 or 8 years ago. We realised when we started involving volunteers in different ways, so in our retail shops, we've got a much more transient volunteer workforce. They want to come in and start volunteering on the day they first walk in the door. They don't want to have to go through a training programme or wait for referencing. So what we're now doing is we're taking our volunteering toolkit and we're reviewing it all and developing bespoke resources and procedures for different parts of the charity, because they've got such different volunteer models, and it's become really successful. We've also developed a volunteer management light. So this is a shorter recruitment process for volunteers who are going to be in lower risk roles. So we didn't think it was appropriate to put up so many barriers for people to start volunteering if all they're going to do is come along to an event once or twice a year. So we've got a much shorter volunteer recruitment process, and that's gone down really well. And hot off the press, hopefully next week we'll be launching a whole new approach to referencing. So traditionally, to be safeguarding our volunteers and our employees, we have asked for 2 written references from all of our volunteers. And what we've decided is we spend an awful lot of time doing that. It doesn't really tell us very much about how valuable the volunteers are. And what our experience shows is that actually it's when they first start, that's when we realise whether it's a good fit for us, whether it's a volunteer that's going to be trustworthy, whether it's going to fit, whether they're going to fit into the team, and whether it's the right role for the volunteer as well. So we're moving away from referencing in all of our roles to a more robust trial period. We will still reference some of our higher risk roles like our education speakers, but a lot of our roles like our shop assistants, our animal welfare assistant volunteers, we'll be ceasing to reference them hopefully from next week. And this is happening in lots of other charities in the volunteer management world. So it's not something that we've just plucked out from thin air. We've done lots of research and lots of charities in a similar position. I think it will save us a lot of time. And then just a little flag here, motivations are critical when involving volunteers, so it's really important that you keep remembering them, not only when you're first looking to recruit volunteers, but when you're supporting them and retaining them later on. Their motivations do change, as all of our motivations change, so it's really important that you have a plan of how you're going to make sure your volunteers are still getting what they want from their volunteer role. So the second sort of area I wanted to address was some cultural issues, and you might be familiar with this sentiment from a number of years ago. Volunteers were viewed as a sort of cheap resource, cheap way of getting more staff. You could pop them into unskilled, routine tasks, get them to do all the jobs that employees didn't want to do, so employees could get on with better jobs. And you could keep them in the same role long term. So you could get someone coming in to clean out a kennel, get them to sign up to do it every Monday for pretty much the rest of their lives. And there are volunteers that will still do that. So often the civic generation of people in their 70s or 80s today probably like to attend volunteer roles where they know they're going to get the same experience every week and do the same sort of routine tasks. But actually what we find nowadays is people are looking for much more of an exchange of time and commitment. So they're looking for targeted, meaningful and rewarding volunteer roles, and they want to be valued and add value themselves. And they want flexibility in the way that they offer their time. And this is all stuff that as an organisation, Blue Cross has been looking at for several years now. And we're now starting to change our volunteer roles to incorporate more of this meaningful, win-win sort of reciprocal relationship between us and our volunteers. So some of the key points culturally that we are addressing at Blue Cross and that I think is really important for developing a successful volunteer workforce are making sure that the leadership is right and that you've got leadership from the top is really important. So are you strategically planning for your volunteers? Do your directors, do your management teams think about volunteering when they're writing their business strategies, when they're developing their budgets, and when they're thinking about the next 5 or 6 years in your organisation? And you probably have all heard about the Olympics and how successful that was with volunteer work in how they involve volunteers. And Jean Tomlin, who was responsible for the whole volunteer programme of the Olympics, really puts down the key for that success was really about they took a one-team approach. So they made sure right from the start that volunteers was going to be a critical success factor in delivering the Olympics. And they made sure that all of their managers, all of their leaders, all of the people involved in delivering the Olympics were clear that volunteers were an integrated part in that programme. So the training was available for employees and volunteers. They got the same communications, the same engagement, they were given the same roles, and volunteers were given the freedom within the parameters of the roles available to sort of shine through and use their personalities and their skills and experience to deliver the roles that they needed to be achieved. And that's really one of the critical things that enabled the success of that programme. And so we're trying to replicate that at Blue Cross. We now, all of our managers know about planning for volunteers, they budget for volunteers. When we plan training and resources and when we plan comms and engagement, we're thinking about volunteers right from the start, not just as a second sort of thought later on once we've sorted out employees. Be really clear, another cultural issue is be really clear who's responsible for volunteers, and it might not just be the volunteer manager, it should be all managers, and it should be anyone who's working alongside a volunteer, and make sure that you're supporting them to do that. So make sure that people have the time and the skills to support volunteers who are working alongside them. So you may need to do some coaching, like we mentioned earlier on, to make sure people understand the differences of a volunteer relationship to that of an employee relationship. And this thing about developing reciprocal relationships is really important. So get to know your volunteers, find out what motivates them, find out why they're there and what they want from the organisation, and recognise that those motivations change. Engagement in voice is really important. Volunteers, and for our charity, and I'm pretty much guessing for your charities as well, are really engaged in what we're trying to do. They're really associated to the cause. They want to help out. They want to have an impact. So, think about how you can engage them in the wider work. And they're representatives of your charity out there in the world. So it's really important that you keep them on side, keep them engaged, communicate with them well. One of the things that we've done at Blue Cross fairly recently is we've included volunteers in our cultural survey. So this is a survey that goes out to all of our employees to look at a whole range of different things about how they feel about working for Blue Cross. And we do a very similar survey now for volunteers. And it came up with some really interesting results. And I'll just run you through a couple of them now. We found out that sorry, you probably can't read this slide very well, but it'll be in your packs. Volunteering leads to much more support. So 35% of our volunteers told us that not only through their volunteering, they also now donate money to Blue Cross, but also 33% of their family and friends also donate money to Blue Cross as a result of their volunteering. And 19% of them also do fundraising for the organisation. So it made us realise that volunteers are a real untapped resource. They offer their time for free, but they also do a lot more for us, and the power of involving them and engaging them is really critical. We also found that volunteers wanted to do a whole load more stuff for us. So whilst we might have thought they were happy in their day-to-day roles, and largely they are, they wanted to get involved in different ways. And some of the really critical things is, for instance, here we learned that 32% of our volunteers want to share their professional skills with us. So what we've done to respond to that is one of the examples of what we've done is we've set up a group called Volunteer Voice, and it's launching next month. It's a group of 16 representative volunteers from our charity who represent all of our volunteer involving functions. They're going to be coming together, and they're going to be our sort of route to consult with volunteers. They're going to have a going to have a look at strategy with us. We're going to consult with them on procedures and policy changes, and we're going to help them sort of engage with other volunteers so they can become a representative volunteer group for us. And the people that applied for that are all really professional people. They've got management experience, they've got leadership, they've been in leadership roles, they've had stakeholder engagement experience, so really professional skills that are going to make a big difference to our volunteer programme. We also found that our volunteers are really well engaged in the organisation. So out of a score of 1 to 7, the mean score was 6.5 for volunteers feeling proud to work for the charity, and 6.3 for wanting to recommend Blue Cross is a good place to volunteer. So really high scores, which really means that we're able to, we're engaging our volunteers really well at the moment, and we're really seeing the benefits of that. The next thing I wanted to just quickly touch is a little signpost to this little bit of research, which has fairly recently come out, and some of you might have already read it. It was completed by NFP Synergy and updated an old report into the 21st century volunteer. So the title is The New Alchemy: How Volunteering Turns Donations of Time and Talent into Human Gold. And what this report does really well, and I'm not going to go into much detail about it today, just to flag it, it looks at the 21st century volunteer. So it looks at changes in society, changes in the way that volunteers are given time, changes in what people want to do with their time. So it looks at, for instance, we live in much more diverse communities these days. We've got much more younger people wanting to volunteer, and they want to do it in groups and with their friends. We've got different family structures, more single households, more working mums, more grandparents caring for grandchildren. All of those changes are impacting on how people can give their time as volunteers. Social media and digital access is a big boom, makes a real difference in the way people want to engage with us. When we did our recent volunteer recruitment campaign, everyone was on the website saying, why can't I apply online? How can I share this on social media with my friends? What can I do about blogging? So it's really opening up the avenues to getting out to people. But you, as a volunteer manager and with your volunteer programs, you need to be able to offer people the opportunities to volunteer in the ways that they want to volunteer. It also runs through the sort of generational differences in volunteers. So I talked a little bit earlier about civics. There's also baby boomers who are retiring now. They want managerial roles, they want responsibility, they want roles they can drop in and out of in between their cruises. So you need to think as a volunteer manager, what's going to attract these people long term for your charity. The study also shows the levels of volunteering have broadly remained static over the last 10 to 20 years, and the time that individual volunteers is given is in decline. So there's a challenge there for all of us. People are getting more used to control and choice over their life, and they want to bring that to their volunteering. So they're much more demanding about what they want and how they give their time. And as an organisation looking for volunteers now, we're not just competing with all of you who are also looking for volunteers. We're also competing with every other charity, but also we're competing against leisure activities and things that people do to spend their time these days. So it's becoming much more competitive. So the challenge for us as volunteer managers is recognise this change, think about how, when you're strategically planning, thinking about long term, how do you want to involve volunteers, and with these changes in mind, how do you need to change your volunteer programmes to remain attractive to volunteers. So really, adaptability and flexibility is key. You're probably going to be looking at shorter term opportunities, episodic opportunities, online virtual opportunities for volunteers, rather than the mainstay of, getting all volunteers on a rota. I've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll whiz quickly through a Blue Cross case study. So we've got about 3,000 volunteers. They give us 350,000 hours a year. We reckon that saves us about £3 million in the employees' costs. For every £1 we spend on volunteer management, we reckon we get back about £3.50 worth of volunteer time, so really good return on investment. And volunteers contribute about a fifth of all the time worked in the charity. So we realise, though, we've got big ambitious plans for the future. We want to help a whole load more pets. I'm sure you all do too. So we need to significantly increase our volunteer hours and our volunteer numbers. And we realised through our volunteer database that about 50% of our volunteers who are registered, trained and ready to work aren't giving time regularly. So there's a bit of an untapped resource there. And equally, in our culture survey, volunteers told us they want to do more, they want to have a larger impact, and they want to use their professional skills. So we had to think about how can we make the most of this. And we developed a new recruitment strategy. I've popped this up. I haven't really got time to run through it now, but it'll be in your packs. So this is different ways that you could increase the number of volunteers that help your charity. So you can recruit more volunteers, or you can reduce the number of volunteer hours lost. And there's a whole load of different ways you might be able to do that. We've done them all in this recruitment strategy that I'm just about to run through. So it's a really good slide to have a look at afterwards. We realised, as probably most of you do, that volunteers come to us because of the cause. They're not so bothered. They want to help animals. They're not so bothered it's the Blue Cross they're helping. So in our recruitment materials, we changed the focus to be all about the pets. So if you're for pets, we're for you is our strategy now. It's about saying, if you love pets, guys, come and help us. There'll be something we can do. It might not be working directly with a pet, but we can do something with your passion for pets. We did lots of external coverage in a national recruitment campaign that we ran in January for 3 weeks. We had lots of press coverage, publications. We did a social media and website campaign. We linked in with Do It, the National Volunteer Database, and we launched an online mailing list. So anyone who came along, was interested in volunteering but couldn't find a role for them just right now, has been able to join a mailing list, of which we've now got about 600 people, so we can keep them in touch as opportunities arise later on in the future. All of our local teams got involved in this national campaign. They did window dressing, they ran displays, they ran taster sessions, and we challenged our existing volunteers, what could you do to help us more? We also ran a campaign called I Volunteer Because. So we asked our volunteers to send in a selfie about holding up a picture of why they volunteer at Blue Cross. Probably 200 or 300 volunteers got involved. The motivations that came through were really passionate, really strong, and it was really interesting exercise that we went through, and they really got involved in it. And we're using these stories now for case studies and as part of the recruitment campaign. So what happened in 3 weeks? We had 935 inquiries. We recruited 200 volunteers. We're still recruiting volunteers from then because some of our recruitment processes are quite long. And we found that website and social media are the real winners of the campaign. People really wanted to engage in that way. They wanted to do online applications. They couldn't back then, but we're just turning on the switch now to make sure our database talks to our website. So from now on, volunteers will be able to apply online. And our existing volunteers really got involved. So it was a really positive campaign, really successful. So just to summarise my really quick presentation, the really important things are get it right from the start, plan for your volunteer involvement, get the foundation and culture right, make sure that volunteers are going to feel welcomed and fit in. Take your volunteers seriously, make someone responsible for them, give them the time to manage them and resource your volunteer programmes. Understand your volunteers, understand their needs and motivations are diverse and they will change over time, and make sure that you allow for that in your programmes and engage and include them in your charity's work. So the really key point is, and it sounds really obvious, but sometimes it can be forgotten, that volunteers and their gift of time is really amazing. They're giving their time to free to help you in your charity. So it's really important that everyone in the charity is aware of that, and they don't just see volunteers as a bit of a pain or, you know, something else they've got to think about. These are people giving their time for free. They're just as important as people giving their money to the organisation.
My name's Jason Cook. I'm the
Here's a
Foster
video about
Scheme
volunteers.
Coordinator for Blue Cross in Andover. I enjoy volunteering because it gives me a chance to develop my skills and team building relationships and give some unloved pets a second chance.
My name's Megan Kelly and I volunteer in the shop in Pershore. I decided to volunteer for Blue Cross because I had a gap year and I wanted to give something back, and animals have given me a lot of pleasure in the past. The people that I work with in the shop are a big range of people, so there's people that are younger and there's people that are older than me. It's really good to work with people that have different experiences in life, and they're like a big family really.
My name is Natalia Doran. I volunteer for Blue Cross with online research. I have always loved animals and wanted to help them. My daytime job is a carer. I have 2 autistic children. They're young adults, but they do need a lot of care. And really, psychologically, it is very good for me to have another focus in my life.
Even though I don't work with pets directly, I'm still helping them in an indirect kind of way, because I'm helping raise money for the pets so that they can have a better life in the future and hopefully be able to be rehomed.
My name's Carol and I'm a volunteer with the Pet Bereavement Support Service. When I retired, I suddenly had loads more time free and I wanted to use my existing skills and knowledge and experience and combine it with my love of animals to help other people. I work from home and the service offers for volunteers a shift pattern, so you can do mornings, afternoons or evenings. It certainly suits my lifestyle and my other commitments.
My motivations for volunteering are to give something back to the Blue Cross that have managed to give us some loved family pets over the last few years. The volunteering role's very flexible. It enables me to pick up my duties when I have the free time.
Although I don't work directly with pets, I like to think that my volunteering fosters an understanding of that special bond between humans and pets.
If you're thinking about volunteering in the new year, then it's definitely something you should just go for.
Okay, so that was just a video we used as part of our recruitment campaign. As you can see, it was our existing volunteers telling us why they love volunteering with us, which we found that really popular. It had all sorts of hits on social media and on the website. So I'm sorry that was such a big rush through, but that's what I would do to make sure I had a successful volunteer workforce. I am here all for the next sort of 2 days, so if anyone's got any questions or if there's something I didn't cover off, come and find me. I suppose the other thing I just wanted to say was, as volunteer managers or people involved in volunteer management, you're not alone. There's a whole load of networks, and here's a list of some of them that you might find helpful. Blue Cross gets involved in almost all of them. In fact, the top one's probably of most relevance to you guys. It's the Animal Welfare Charities Volunteer Management Networking Group. We set this up a few years ago with Battersea and Dogs Trust and Cats Protection. We meet quarterly. It's quite operational, but it's an opportunity for people involved in volunteer management to come together and just go, what's going on with you? How do you deal with this? How do you do with that? Do you involve volunteers here? What do you do about it? And it's really positive network. So if any of you aren't aware of that network and want to get involved, then pop me a little email. I've got business cards here, or you have my email address on the side. So get in touch if you want to. Has anyone got any questions now, or are we running out of time? Sorry, we've run out of time. That's a shame.
Thank you very much, Karen. There'll be a short break now whilst we allow people to move between the 2 streams.